Thank you so much, Fru. And today we're exploring the intersection of science and therapy and self-awareness with Dr. Dan Siegel. And really, for decades, as many of you know, Dan has been a real pioneer in the field of interpersonal neurobiology, weaving together insights from neuroscience, psychology, contemplative practices, and has helped deepen our understanding collectively and ours personally. I think many of us on this call, our understanding of the mind and human relationships. He is an enormous influence. It's a real privilege to have him here today. And in his latest book, he's written more than 20 now, Personality and Wholeness in Therapy. Dan dives into the patterns of developmental pathways, PDP, a framework that we're going to talk about today, learn about, that integrates the Enneagram with neurobiology to illuminate how personalities form and evolve and influence our lives and behavior. In the next hour, we will unpack this model and explore how understanding these pathways can enrich personal growth and maybe your clinical practice if you have that orientation, as I suspect many of our guests do. Dan, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. We've got so much rich content to dig into, but I wanted to start with a deep cut. I was reviewing this morning an article that you wrote back in 2019 called Expanding Your Holiday Hub. And I was thinking that, here we are moving into a space of stress and maybe some emotion or anxiety, not just in the world, but also as we move into our familial spaces with the holidays. And I wondered if you might have a contemplative or a meditative reflection for us before we dig into the content of today's session.
Sure. Well, thank you, Steve. Thanks for having me here, and thank you all for being here. And Fru, thank you for handling the technical backup for this wonderful gathering. Why don't we do a brief practice? There's an extended one you can do called the Wheel of Awareness from my website, drdansiegel.com, for free. You can access it, but let's just do a basic practice for a couple of minutes where first we feel grounded, and whether your camera's on or camera's off, whatever is comfortable for you is fine for this setting. But just let yourself get connected to the body you're born into. And just, if you want, you can ride the wave of the breath in and out. And as we let the breath fill awareness, you may begin to feel a shift that grounds you in the body here on earth. But amazingly, when we let awareness become filled with the breath, we come to realize that even sensing something as profound as the cycle of the in-breath and the out-breath puts us in touch with kind of an object of our awareness, in this case, the breath. But we have this experience of being aware that in many ways stays with us no matter what we're aware of. So let attention now go from the breath to the larger sense of the body, perhaps the fingers, if you want to move them around a little bit, all the way out to your toes, moving your toes around. And as you move these digits on your feet and on your hands, know that this body you're born into is just one aspect of a larger self that you are. We are not just the skin encased body, but see if you can feel into letting awareness now invite the sense of connection to all of us here on this gathering together, whether it's just imagining our connection, which is a powerful image, or sensing into what in systems terms we can call a relational field, that all of us gathered here together are creating this field of connection. Just like Faraday talked about electromagnetic fields, we have our relational connections. Just see if you can open awareness to that sense of connectedness to all of us here gathered today. And as we invite awareness to become even more open, receiving a sense of connection, not just to those human beings here connected, but to all people in our lives, our friends, our family, our colleagues, our neighbors, a connection to all people who live on this precious and wondrous planet, this home we've named Earth. And then letting that sense of connection widen even further to include all of nature, to all living beings, plants, fungi, animals, the environment, to all of nature. This membership in the whole of nature as a sensation, a perspective from the whole, an agency acting on behalf of the whole, that kind of spa sensation, S, perspective, P, agency. And this is a way of defining the self that puts us as a center of experience that has lots of ways we can adjust the kind of identity lens, which is what we're doing right now, to widen it to include all of nature, and then narrowing it down again to include our human family. And as if you had a camera, adjusting the focus now, narrowing it even closer to our family and friends, those connections we have with people we know directly. And then narrowing your lens a little bit more to all of us gathered here for this Garrison meeting here in digital space. And then narrowing it further down to the skin encased body, letting that sensation of the body, the perspective through your ears and eyes, through this body you're born into, and the agency where you can try moving your arms around, moving your legs. This spa is your embodied self. And we have then a lens of identity that can intentionally be adjusted to recognize we are a me in a body, and we are a we in our relationships with other people and the whole planet. And this can be combined, the me and the we, as a we identity, an integrated way of differentiating the body from all of our relationships with this body to the world of people and the whole of nature. So now I invite you once again to find the breath of the bodies we were born into and ride the wave of the breath in and out. And now taking a deeper, more intentional breath, letting it go. If your eyes are closed, you can let them get ready to come open. And we'll bring this brief identity practice to a close for now, knowing that you can always use this identity lens to adjust it throughout the day, to feel into this larger we that we are. Thank you for going on that journey.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you for that space making for us as we move into this conversation. And congratulations first on the book. And I by way of asking you to tell the story of the framework that you have developed here, it occurs to me that at this point in your career and with your writing success and your studies, you've written so extensively. I have to imagine at this point you have some liberty in what you want to explore. And I would just love to hear why this book. And can you maybe share how you discovered the Enneagram as an area of potential study?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Steve, for being here and for that question. Briefly, I had written a lot about how attachment relationships between young children and their caregivers, their parents, primarily shape the way their brain develops. And some people approached me saying, that's interesting what you said, but you left out a big area of development, which is temperament. And it is true that I focus primarily on attachment. And research had demonstrated that temperament doesn't determine attachment. So I didn't put much energy into that. So 20 years ago, I went to a meeting to study through a popular system of personality called the Enneagram of Personality, or shortened to just be Enneagram, which means a 9-pointed figure. And, I was struck by the patterns of personality, which mean patterns of emotion, thought, and behavior that persist across time and situations. I was struck by how fascinating these distinct 9 patterns were. And so there were 4 other scientists gathered at that meeting of about 50 people that we lived together for a week. And we started chatting about how could the lens of this field I work in, interpersonal neurobiology, where we combine all the sciences together, could that be used in any way to bring science to ask the question, is there a science of these Enneagram patterns? And so we began a journey 20 years ago. David Daniels was one of those people. His daughter, Denise Daniels, who's a researcher in the area of genetics of temperament and personality. Her best friend, who's a professor in the genetics of personality, is Laura Baker. And Jack Killen, who's the deputy medical director of the Institutes of Health, Complementary and Alternative Medicine. So Jack and Laura and Denise and David, who is a clinical professor of psychiatry at Stanford, who had become a leader in the field of the Enneagram of personality. And so we began a journey to try to apply interpersonal neurobiology, the field I work in, which combines all these fields of science. And over the course, on and off of 20 years, we came up with various proposals. We tried them out. They didn't work. We got rid of them, tried out more, didn't work. And then finally, we landed on a framework that I'm happy to show you on some slides if you want, that actually fit with, we had about 50,000 narratives from the oral tradition taken in what's called the narrative Enneagram school over the course of 30 years. So we had a rich source of data that I was always doubtful about because it was all done in the lens of going to a workshop on the Enneagram. But I'm happy to say that in analyzing those narratives, and I'm trained as a narrative scientist through NIMH, we could come up with a set of empirical research-based science findings that now can be tested. And since we came up with that framework, Carol Dweck, a professor of psychology at Stanford, independently came up with an integrative model of motivation, temperament, and personality that matches our PDP model completely. It's quite remarkable, actually. So while initially I would say, well, this is our way of interpreting the Enneagram, now because Carol Dweck analyzed, all of academic research on psychology's view of personality, not including the Enneagram, and came up with the same conclusions we came up with, primarily looking at the Enneagram, then it's a very exciting moment of saying this may in fact, well, it needs to be tested, but it may in fact be a coherent universal model of personality itself, not just an interpretation of the Enneagram. So we honor its origins and inspiration in the Enneagram, but now with Carol Dweck's findings, we can say it is consilient, this term E.O. Wilson comes up with the larger view of the academic study of personality patterns. So that's kind of the background of it. I am busy doing lots of other things, but there was something about this. I'm a therapist, so there was something about using this in therapy to help clients, to help patients distinguish what was their temperament versus what was their attachment. So just like the Alcoholics Anonymous, prayer, let me have the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. Let me have the courage to change the things I can. And let me have the wisdom to know the difference. As a therapist, it felt really important in working with clients to be able to say, what can you really change? Because you may not be able to change temperament but you can move personality from low levels of functioning to higher levels of functioning within a given temperamental pattern, if you will, that we'll go over. So that the temperament pattern may not be that changeable, but the high level of functioning can be achieved. So you can basically have personality move from being a prison of chaos and rigidity to a playground of connection and possibility. So that was exciting. And then you could then say attachment, if it's not secure, is completely changeable. You can move non-secure attachment to secure attachment completely. So then you could know I can have the courage to change my attachment, the serenity to say, I may always have this personality pattern, and the wisdom to then distinguish between those two. So, having family relatives in Alcoholics Anonymous, I was also very excited I could apply the serenity prayer in a way. And then another thing that happened that was kind of a shocker, I got to say, while, my colleagues and I were initially trying to offer a scientific view of the Enneagram, as I began to teach therapists at the Mindsight Institute, where we teach all these therapists around the world, and I would ask them, well, what have you learned about personality in therapy? And just like me, 99% of them, of thousands of therapists, said, I was taught nothing. Even though there is something called personality dynamics, and there is an academic field of the big five where, you look at how open you are versus closed, how, what's the C for conscientious you are versus not conscientious, how extroverted or introverted, how this spells the word ocean, agreeable or not agreeable, and how neurotic or cool as a cucumber you are, there weren't really applications in therapy. So then it became an even larger journey in the 6 years of writing this book to say, this is not just a book about the neuroscience developmentally of the Enneagram. It was really, what is personality? How does it relate to temperament? How does a therapist broadly use it? And how can we use these wonderful insights from the field of the Enneagram to build on the developmental neuroscience? And now we can say also build on the synthesis of all of the academic research on personality. So it's a very exciting moment, I got to say, to bring this out into the world. The book itself is written for mental health professionals, but I work a lot with activists in the human rights world and in the climate activism world. And I think there are nine pathways that people burn out and 9 pathways to reignite their passion. And they're very specific to each of the patterns. So it's not just about therapy. It's also, in the activism work that is going on in the world, it's also something that potentially could be really helpful. So in speaking about this to Joanna Macy, for example, Joanna's been in this for decades, and she's been seeing activists really burn out in rates that she's never seen before. So my hope is that this framework can let each person know which of 9 ways might they be particularly vulnerable, and how are they driven to help the world be a better place, and using contemplative practices, building on indigenous wisdom, finding all those conciliant approaches. I hope this view of personality will be helpful.
I really want to explore with you and ask you to give us a little bit of grounding in the 9 core patterns in just a minute. I'm gonna throw a kind of a curveball at you if you don't mind. Our mutual friend Cynthia Bourgeau, in her book The Holy Trinity and the Law of Three, she is a big student of Gurdjieff's work. She writes about the Enneagram. You have to admit that there's something brilliant, even damnably strategic in its design. Using classic ego bait, let me learn my type, some interesting new thing about me. It draws people in, only to put in their hands basic tools for self-observation and non-identification. Students rapidly develop the capacity to see that they are, in fact, not their type. It is simply an impersonal, mechanical pattern that plays out within them. And it seems to me, Dan, that you tackle this really straight on with the sophistication and the nuances of the model by describing the PDP as tendencies and not types. And I'd just like to ask you to linger on that for a second with us.
Yeah, that's absolutely right on, Stephen. Thank you. That's a beautiful. I don't know if it's a curveball or it's joining in the journey. That's beautiful. Thank you for quoting that from Cynthia. You know, the exciting thing is that you know, there's a number of ways to approach this. You know, so we can say that. Let me see how to put this. Personality, in a sense, is this is what I believe after kind of focusing on this for 20 years with my colleagues. Personality is a filter through which our temperament, which is a proclivity of the nervous system, is dealing with some fundamental existential realities of being here alive on Earth. And we can go over those in particular, but the broad statement then is that the contemplative practice we did in the beginning of this session invites us to drop into an open awareness that lets us go beyond identifying, for example, with the body as the totality of who we are. And I talk about this in a book called Intraconnected, and expand to realize we are relationships with other people and all of nature. Now, that awareness, and I wrote a whole book called Aware about this, you know, that awareness can be seen as coming from this, I call it a plane of possibility, where all possibilities are resting. What the former president of the Mind and Life Organization, you know, called the quantum vacuum, you know, and Arthur Zients also names that quantum vacuum the formless source of all form. And when Arthur and I were teaching together at a meeting, I don't know, it was almost 10 years ago now, you know, what was beautiful about it was he could take his quantum physics background. He's an emeritus professor of quantum physics. And we could look at how the wheel of awareness lets you distinguish the pure hub experience from the rim, and that the qualities that people describe in that journey are very much the distinct qualities of going from the Newtonian realm to the quantum realm. And physics has demonstrated we have these two realms, just like you have the realm of swimming in water and the realm of walking on land. So I say all that just to say that when you drop into the contemplative capacity to be in awareness, you drop beneath personality. But when you come back into realizing you're in a body and you have a temperament, and your temperament has, your nervous system has a history. So temperament is just the proclivity of your nervous system. You know, it's going to drive certain ways energy is filtered into its expression as emotion, as thought, you know, what you believe, what matters to you basically, and how you behave. So we call that personality. So I really love the quote you gave, Steve, and it is, you know, it's something I put initially in the beginning of the book, and then people said, oh, it's too much in the beginning. So I put it in the middle. Then they said, it's still too much. So I put it at the end. So when you read the last 3 chapters, you'll see a deep dive into this exact issue, that ultimately who we really are is not at all our personality pattern. But if you live in a body, it's something you need to work with, that you do have a personality pattern. And this is the beauty, I think, of what we do at the Garrison Institute. I say we because I've been on the board for, I think now 15 years. You know, we're really encouraging deep contemplative practice to lend itself this. So I was teaching to a number of mindfulness teachers in Oxford and in Hollyhock in British Columbia. And what was really exciting to teach these professionals who are the teachers of mindfulness is when they went over the 9 patterns, which we'll go over in a moment, what they each said to me was quite amazing, was as, you know, a workshop leader, as a person who's a mindfulness teacher, there were 9 ways that different participants in the workshops had trouble developing a mindfulness practice or being in the mindfulness practice, and that these 9 patterns that we're about to talk about helped them clarify the troubles that they were having, And that was exciting. And, it's not a all or nothing thing. You can have more than one pattern. So when we go into the model, you see how fluid this model is, the PDP model. And I hope that'll be helpful to see that.
And let's move into that space, Ben, and let me ask you to orient us. And the Enneagram I have heard over the years and taken like online tests and so on. But I like the PDP framework is really like these 3 by 3 matrix, right? The intersection of these items. And I wondered if you'd walk us through agency, bonding, and certainty, and then how those express.
Absolutely. And what do you feel, Steve, about me? We hadn't really talked about this, but me sharing some slides that you can visualize.
I think that's very appropriate in this case because it may be a lot to visualize without.
Yeah. So let's do that. And yeah, let me share this with you and let me see if it. Can everybody see those slides?
Yes.
Ultimately, we're going to talk about these 9. So you're going to see where we're going to come to in what I call now a personality palette. And I need to say, because my co-authors have required that I say this, that, we made this book together. It was a joint effort. And the book was born, 2 days ago. And now everything that each of us individually teach is our own thing. And so I may say things that my co-authors do not agree with and they would not support necessarily. So this gives me the freedom as a clinician to just say what I feel is the case. And the other 3, one of them sadly has passed away, but David Daniels. But so this is my perspective. So that's the way you're going to see it. So let's go back to here. Our story begins with the experience of wholeness. And this becomes an important point. And we spent many years trying to figure out, why did people use this word in the journey towards what we would call integration or wellness or clarity or whatever. But they would use this word. And because it's such an overused word, we tried not to use it. We're scientists. We want to be very specific. But in the end, we decided to embrace it. And when you looked at the neurobiology of memory, and this is now a part of the proposal you may not agree with, and you don't need it to understand the rest of the model. But I think it really helps, and it helps for me personally, but it also helps in how we can understand people's subjective experiences. So you begin with wholeness, but then what happens is you go from being in the womb where there's effortless being, meaning you don't have to do anything. You are just being, and there's no separation. And people always say, well, what if my mother was traumatized? Or what if the family was in a lot of stress, or there was domestic violence? Absolutely, those stressors would have an effect, and we can research that. But in general, even if those things were going on, there was effortless being. You didn't have to do anything. But once you're born, you have to do something, right? And so this doing is literally a do or die situation, that if you don't breathe, you die. If you don't eat, you die. If you don't have a connection with somebody, you die. So what we felt was happening after looking at a lot of the neuroscience, trying out different things, is that there were 3 what we'll call vectors that were built on these networks beneath the cortex, the highest part of the brain, that Jaak Panksepp, a wonderful researcher who's written, there's books, and I edited a series of books, 100 books we're at now in the Interpersonal Neurobiology series. And one of them is Jaak's, actually 2 of them are Jaak Panksepp's books. And in those books, he talks about the deep subcortical networks involved in anger, separation, distress, and fear. And when you look at how those networks are involved with a larger set of neural connections, it's about motivation. And when you just name that as ABC, agency, bonding, and certainty, you begin to realize that, some kids, and this is now we're going to propose as temperament, some kids, it's all about agency, being a center of initiative action. And that's kind of their jam. And anger is more likely to be their experience when that's frustrated. Some, their temperament is an orientation, more reactivity towards bonding. And when that's thwarted, they have separation, distress, and sadness. And others, their motivation is for certainty. And when that's thwarted, you get anxiety and fear. And what we noticed that is in the 50,000 narratives we had of the Enneagram, you could cluster those 9 Enneagram, quote, types, the stories, into these 3 distinct motivations, right? So in the Enneagram world, they talk about centers of intelligence. We couldn't find evidence at this point anyway from science of intelligence centers, but we did find energy activation areas that included the head for the certainty group, the heart for the bonding group, and the gut for the agency group in ways we can talk about later on, but not that it's a center of intelligence. And so this was our proposal. This was a part of Temperament. And what was fascinating about it, as I mentioned, is discovering a few months ago a paper that had come out after we published our initial work. And that's from Carol Dweck. And these right here are the references. And so Carol Dweck is this wonderful researcher who came up with the growth mindset work. And she's a professor at Stanford. And she's not a personality researcher, but she decided, because she loved the field, to synthesize all the existing literature on personality studies. And she came up with 3 fundamental needs that happen after the baby's born for competence. And I spoke with Carol Dweck about this, which correlates with our agency, her acceptance, which correlates with our bonding, and her predictability, which correlates with our certainty. And she also postulates a universal need for coherence, which matches what we call wholeness. And she beautifully describes, and I'm an acronym nut, so she has this great acronym, BEATS, for beliefs, emotions, and action tendencies, which correlate directly with, in our view, with adaptive strategies. So the model is virtually identical, quite amazing. And here's a quote from her 2022 chapter in a textbook on personality research, theory and research. She says, the newborn, after floating happily in a familiar environment in which all needs are automatically met, arrives in its new world knowing almost nothing about it. Steps need to be taken, and quickly. This is exactly a paraphrase, basically, of exactly what we say in our whole model. So to see that from this esteemed professor of psychology was quite an amazing moment for me before our book was released. And it's in these two references you have here, and I'm happy to make this available to you. But those are paper. The book chapter would be hard to get unless you bought the textbook, but the paper you can get, I think, online. Foundations for a Theory of Motivation, Personality, and Development is the subtitle for the Needs, Goals, and Representations paper, and her chapter is called Toward an Integrative Theory of Motivation, Personality, and Development, and that's exactly what our whole PDP model is. So, you can look at that agency, bonding, and certainty, and Carol Dweck has a beautiful additional 3 things for esteem, what you feel about yourself and your worthiness in the eyes of others, trust, and these come up at the boundaries, esteem from agency and bonding, trust from bonding and certainty, and then a need for control between certainty and agency. So that's an interesting added thing to this model. And this is all about our personality palette. And this is, if you stay with the circle view, it gets very complicated in the view. But this is what we're going to look at here, that when you combine what we call a vector of agency, bonding, and certainty with another aspect of what we think is temperament that I've named as a tendency, which is your tendency of attention. And Mary Helen Imordino Yang actually found this 10 years earlier in her brain studies, that people tend to be with their energy or focus of attention inward, some are outward, and some are kind of this combination of inward and outward. And so what happens, and I'm happy to give you the Enneagram numbers if you're an Enneagram enthusiast, but what happens if you're born with a temperament of agency and a tendency of inward is you used to be whole in the womb, you come out of the womb, and now you have an adaptive strategy, which is a mapping pattern, where you have an internal map of how things should be with high expectations. And this inward aspect of your temperament means that with this internal map, you're going to get some sense of your needs being met by trying to make the world outside match what your map is in the inside. If, in contrast, you're in the dyadic tendency, you have your attention both inward at how things ought to be, but outward at how things are. So you develop this adaptive strategy of harmonizing. And I'm basically giving you a summary that takes about 3 sentences. Then the book takes about 20 pages each. So excuse me for it being abbreviated, but when you write a book over 6 years, and it used to be twice as long, so I had to. I took a year to make it half the length, literally half the length. But anyway, you get this harmonizing pattern. These are words I made up. We don't have these words in the book. But since then, I've been teaching a lot, and I needed something more than just saying agency dyadic. People couldn't remember that. So harmonizing is the pattern that comes out. It's a neutral term, and each of these, for example, you can have a downside, a low integrated state, what some people call low vibe state. The vulnerable side of mapping is you're excessively looking for perfection and expectations, and you're shooting all over yourself and everybody else, and so when things don't go your way, you're really angry and irritated, and so that's, if you think about a camping trip, that would be a hard person to have on the camping trip, because when things didn't go their way, they'd be so upset. But the reason you'd want this person on a camping trip is because they'd be very comprehensive and complete. They would bring everything that was needed to be brought on the trip. They'd be able to handle all sorts of things because they are mapping. So mapping is a neutral term that can have a vulnerable side and a strength side. Same with harmonizing. The downside of the harmonizing adaptive strategy is that you lose touch with what you yourself need. So this person might not have packed what they needed for the camping trip because they were busy just thinking about how to get everybody else to get along and avoid conflict. But if they're on the higher side, they'd be amazing to help deal with conflicts and help people resolve differences in opinions and things like that. So every pattern has both a vulnerable, low integrated side and a strengths, high integrated side. And that's the movement in self-reflective work. Inner reflective work is to move to the higher side and then be able to tap into all the other patterns themselves.
And Dan, as either an individual who's interested in learning about themselves and where they might map here into the model, do you recommend using like the narrative Enneagram assessment, or working with a therapist, or is this something we can explore on our own?
Yeah, David has an interview, a questionnaire that has a bunch of statements in it that some people in our group think is very useful and valid. I am a very reluctant believer in those things, so we created our own. We, meaning some interns and I, created a set of statements, and then this summer I did research on that. So very carefully curated statements that were on a Likert scale. 5 is, yeah, I agree with this a lot. 3, not so much, or in the middle, and 1, not at all, kind of thing. And then I studied hundreds of people. And then I was able to look at the statistics on their responses. And then I was able to actually live with people and give that scale, who then found their baseline pattern after, 3 days of 4 days of study. And I can tell you with both humility and relief, 50% of the time it's accurate, and 50% of the time it's totally inaccurate. And so, no, I do not believe in having anyone do anybody's questionnaire. I'll just say that. This is where it's my opinion. You can do them, but you have to take them with a lot of grain of salt. And what I've found in teaching the PDP model is people who did take Enneagram tests of all sorts would say they found out they were a number, let's say, whatever, a 3. They were a 3 in quotes. That's the way they use the wording. And they tried to live into being a good 3, but then they do the PDP model and they realized actually that wasn't their baseline at all. And they had grabbed onto it because that's what the questionnaire did. And they spent years trying to be that thing, and it never quite fit. and then they see this PDP model and they get a freedom from it.
Mm.
And patterns are what we use instead of types, is that type implies a fixed kind of category. Pattern implies a variety of values on a range of various factors. And so this model allows you to see where you can vary those factors, not just from going from low to high, but you can choose, for example, I can choose, I'll get to mine, I'll tell you how I can use it. But, we can go through all of them, Steve, or I can just give you those two as samples, whatever you feel how you want to use the time.
I really appreciate in the book you talk about your own exploration of your own type, and you
Yeah.
encourage clinicians to use the tool themselves as well.
Well, to use now let's be clear. When you say use the tool, you mean use the understanding of the pattern to free themselves up from being a prison and go to a playground.
Therapist, know thyself is your phrase,
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. Exactly. But I want to
Um,
be clear. There's no brief questionnaire that quickly has you find yourself, and we don't use the word type. So we use the word pattern, and we ask people to be very open about it and fluid, and it could be that you have more than one baseline, by the way. And there's lots of reasons to think you could tap into a number of them, and maybe, and we don't know yet, we have to do the research, but maybe 10% of people actually don't have just one or two baselines. Maybe they can relate to all of these, and that's okay. So we want people to be true to themselves and not trying to shove themselves into a grid like this.
as I reviewed the collections of patterns and compared my Enneagram results and sort of looked to see where I might fit and
Yeah, how did that turn
what
out? We haven't talked about this yet, so this is fun.
was I'm in the certainty inward, the CI category, and I'm curious, like, and I'm just going to follow your lead, Dan, because you talk about your experience and meeting other people and what resonated as true for you and not, but how you might use this result or identification with me as either a client or someone that you were helping support.
Yeah, well, exactly. So when you look at this whole grid, and Steve, you're asking us to look down here to the certainty vector and the inward tendency.
Mhm.
So the first thing to say is, in the model, what we suggest is that we're all born with temperament. And these are two new proposals over the research on temperament. There's general research on temperament, which means an inborn propensity of the nervous system that is not created by experience. So that's what we mean by the word temperament. So this is new to say A, B, and C are aspects of temperament, and a tendency is an aspect of temperament. So that's new. So the exciting thing about that is you can say, okay, what does it mean if I'm you, Steve? What does it mean for me to have certainty be the motivational vector that's activated now that I'm out of the womb and wholeness? Well, I can speak, in broad terms, if there were attachment challenges towards non-security, and I myself, Dan, have had every form of non-secure attachment that exists. So, I've had ambivalence, I've had avoidance, and I've had disorganized attachment with my caregivers. So what we are suggesting that does is it intensifies how the certainty, and in my case, the dyadic, a tendency, will then push my adaptive strategies to basically make me more prone to chaos and rigidity. So if you were my client, I would ask you about your life. We might go over this grid, and you might say, hey, Dan, I'm really resonating with the preparing pattern, that my adaptive strategy, my beats in Carol Dweck's terms, my beliefs, emotions, and action tendencies are to be in this preparing pattern way, and that if I'm prepared, I will gain some kind of certainty, right? So you do that by protecting your knowledge, gaining more knowledge, gaining expertise, surrounding yourself with experts. You do this by protecting your time. Make sure your calendar is clear and you're not wasting time. Make sure your space is well, created. So you feel space, time, and knowledge give you a sense of preparing for the uncertainty of the world. And so that can be a fantastic place to begin. And if it's too intense, let's say you've had non-secure attachment, then you will be prone to chaos where you get very agitated if it's, you're not able to be controlling your space or time or knowledge, or you may shut down in rigidity. So that movement to chaos or rigidity is a movement out of what I call a window of tolerance, where you are now driven to not be in an integrated flow of harmony. So you and I would work on developing secure attachment. That's one mode. And we'd work at the growth edge, which is to say, you can achieve a sense of certainty by ironically embracing the uncertainty of just pure awareness. So I might invite you to do the wheel of awareness, where it would give you this feeling beneath that, we call them plateaus, beneath this filtering plateau that was getting you to be preparing, and you would feel this urge to prepare, and you would drop into just not knowing. And in that journey, then you would see that actually the way you achieve this sense of readiness is to let go of being prepared. Ironically, but that's actually a way of preparing. So you kind of meet the need, but you do it with a different angle. It doesn't have to be your space, your time, your knowledge. So you find this harmony through the hub of the wheel, if you will, that hub of the holiday, right? And so you can have a different way of framing what the belief is about what it really means to be living with wholeness in life. And that's the kind of work that would be very different, than, let's say, for me, where my baseline is right next to you here in the certainty dyadic, where I have inward and outward attention. And my adaptive strategy, instead of preparing, is I question everything. I doubt everything. I doubt my doubts. I question my questions. I never accept what any expert says. I'm always challenging things, and that can be exhausting. And with my non-secure attachment history, it means I'm filled with fear and anxiety. And what you're seeing in the lighter shade text is the emotion regulation mode. So while your pattern tends to down-regulate the emotion of fear and contain and channel it, mine is actually up-regulating it, and I'm experiencing and expressing it. So you may seem like you're much more contained, whereas I'm like, oh, really worry. So if you were working with me as my therapist, you would help me develop secure attachment, and you would help me work on having faith that the world actually is going to provide something. And as I got into the wheel of awareness and did my work at the hub, I'd come to realize that plane of possibility, that formless source of all form, taps me into a source that's beyond my control. And I can allow that plane of possibility to be the place from which I live. So this is where you go beneath, in a way, the filter, which allows the filter itself, because I live in a body, to become more like a playground. So I can use my questioning tendency, because of my personality, to write books, and so my writing of a book, is about questioning reality and seeing if there's any way I could try to articulate with words something maybe closer to reality than what was initially offered in the world of science or whatever, so that drives me to write a book. But then what I need to do that is I need to go into your primary baseline pattern and be preparing the book by going inward that way, developing knowledge and careful with my time and space to write the book. And then I sometimes will then go over, staying in the same vector, but I'll go over to the outward tendency, and I become a seeking pattern-based moment in my life. And I tap into that ability to then seek different activities, being a part of the Garrison Institute, running my own institute, teaching over in this group or that group, and anything that is an opportunity to bring the truth out into the world as best that can be articulated, and if it's useful, I can then go back and forth among these three, where those of us who are seeking certainty, it's really about truth. I have dear friends who are also writers, but their primary pattern is up in the bonding group. And so if they're, let's say, in the same tendency dyadic, and they're in this producing adaptive strategy, they're producing things in the world to get other people's approval. So they get a feeling of wholeness by producing something, a performance, a book, whatever it is, and their product is like a proxy for themselves, like an avatar. So if other people say, hey, I loved your book, and lots of people buy their book, then they feel whole. I like it when people read my books. It's nice. It's a really good feeling, but I'm not writing them for anyone to approve of me. I'm writing it so I can try to articulate the truth as best I can, as close to it as I can. And that's what's rewarding. And then I put it out in the world, and I really feel deeply moved when people say that helped me. That's great. But unlike my friend who's devastated if people don't buy it, I've had books where not that many people buy them, and I'm okay because I really believed in the book. So that's the difference where your motivation is. And so that's where this becomes so helpful. And in the bonding group, because we've done almost all of them now, the adaptive strategies for inward bonding are different from the producing one of the dyadic. Here, you're used to be in the womb, you're out in the world, and now you become immersed in this longing for connection that is missing because you're no longer whole in the womb. And because it's inward, but the drive is for relational connections outward, if you can express this immersive set of emotions you're having and other people see them, not so much they approve of them as in the producing pattern, but they see them in you. If you're seen, then you feel soothed and you feel whole. And that's very different from the outward form of this vector, where when the tendency is outward, there's all this focus on others, the needs of others, and people get a feeling of wholeness when they can meet other people's needs. So that's how that all works. And just to finish up all 9, so we do it when you're in the agency vector. So it's about embodied empowerment, and your tendency is outward. What's fascinating is there you're in the middle of directing other people about what to do. And if you're in the low side of that, it's really irritating because someone's telling you what to do all the time. But if it's in the upside of it, where the person can be flexible, they're incredible protectors of people. They're incredible directors of things, and they get stuff done. So every single one of these patterns has an upside and a vulnerable side, a side that's not so integrated. And that's the beautiful thing, I think, about this model, that you can build your access to your own higher side and then let people tap into the higher sides of each of the other 8 that may not be your baseline. They all become available to you. Yeah.
I really want to emphasize for our audience that the book is so rich in exploring each of these 9 patterns, and with resources and ideas about that exploration that I'm really enjoying connecting with. Because this is.
Steve, can I ask you a question?
Please, yes.
You're not a therapist, right?
Correct, right.
Good. So you can make a direct statement to this. Though the book is, designed for therapists to see how they use it, how does it sit with you as a non-therapist reading this book?
I find it quite accessible, but I'm wondering, Dan, if that is because of my interest in having a contemplative practice and being more just maybe primed or curious and about my self-awareness. And so that part has been very easy to follow. I mean, it's certainly, the evidence base is front and center because you're clearly writing from that perspective. But I found it very accessible.
Beautiful, great. Well, that's beautiful, Stephen. I don't know, we touched lightly on the book, and the next book I'm writing will go more deeply into this. But there's also this fundamental part of our journey, which is the attachment experiences we've had. If they're secure, our hypothesis is you're more likely to have developed towards the higher, more integrative functioning of that pattern, but you would have still been in the same pattern baseline. But if you're non-secure, either in the ambivalent, which maximizes the attachment system, or the avoidant, meaning you're adapting to what's going on and you're minimizing the attachment system because of the disconnection with your caregivers, or disorganized, where you had terrifying experiences, so it fragments the attachment system and you have a lot of dysregulation. These 3 stances, if you will, each produce in their own interesting ways a movement towards the lower end of each pattern.
Mm.
So, I give examples of clinical cases in the book. But what this helps you see is that this is completely movable, where you can move from avoidance, disorganization, or ambivalence to security, but that which pattern you're in won't change when you do that important integrative work of developing security. You'll just move from the lower functioning of it to the higher functioning. And
Mm.
so that's something, that you get a taste of it in this book, and you get the general concept. And it's important as you read through the book, for those who are going to read it, to know that there's a lot of room for change and growth, which is what I find so both incredibly rewarding about bringing this out in the world after these 20 years, but also, so fun, to empower people to make this information their own, so they can do what Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. So it prepares your mind. And for you in a preparing pattern, I'm happy that it resonates with you, Steve.
That's perfect. And Dan, we're gonna in just a minute, we're gonna open things up to our participants because I know they want to engage with you and they may have some questions. So, audience, if you're thinking about a question, we're going to give you some instructions in just a second. I'm just going to ask though, Dan, as we move into that space, for you to just share a little bit about this is such I don't want to present it as a culmination of your work. It's just so consistent with a lot of your other really leading work about our interconnected existence, our relational selves, and the blending of attachment and personality tendencies in this space seems to me to be very important. And often in our contemplative practices, we were discussing recently that if we have a tendency to be more inward focused, then a contemplative practice is not necessarily going to change that. It may reinforce that inward focus, and the opposite
Yeah.
may be true of the external. But in this case, you're actually laying out a roadmap that describes or points toward wholeness in our personality expression and our work to develop as a person. And it seems to me that it would be of special interest as a tool for people interested in the interconnected aspects of a contemplative practice.
Yeah, I totally agree, Steve. And it'd be fascinating to see, well, at Garrison for sure we could do this, but just in general contemplative work, I've presented this, to the mindfulness program at Oxford, which has a whole extensive mindfulness teacher training program, and other, deep, transformation programs that offer, step-by-step ways of people leading to things. And so when someone's asked the question of what I mean by shifting, there's two basic things. One is you can grow or shift the way your nervous system literally is functioning in the lower integrative state, moving it to the higher integrative state. And in the book, I kind of outline what the brain mechanisms of that would be. But that's a journey that we talk about as working at the growth edge for your particular pattern. So there are 9 general growth edges that are quite distinct across the 9 different patterns. So that's the exciting thing. It becomes a specific way of doing this shifting, this growing. But the other shifting is, like, I'll just give you an example from my own life. I read a paper that came, as papers do through your emails or whatever. And it was a very disturbing finding about something related to some people close to me medically. And so, I went from being filled with worst case scenario thinking in my pattern as a certainty dyadic questioner, and to be feeling filled with fret. I had to move over to my inward work of going to the preparing pattern of the certainty inward, and did a lot of research. So I got, about 15 different papers on the subject to see what was changeable, what was not changeable, what could be done based on this new finding that had been published. Was there an intervention I needed to do as a, person in this circle of people I know? And then ultimately, when I realized there was nothing that could be done, I allowed myself intentionally to take my energy outward, you know, to turn on some music, to start dancing, to look for some fun activities, go for a hike. And it wasn't so much a distraction as almost an embracing of the acceptance that life is filled with stuff that happens, whether it's an election result or a medical finding or the climate reports from the United Nations, and that we can still be devoted to change and trying to make the world a better place. But we have to make sure that our nervous system doesn't live in a threat mindset, but can move towards a challenge mindset where we take on the difficulties in life as, you know, as I said to Joanna Mason, you know, before I wrote the book Interconnected, we take it on as a dance partner. And then we have this challenge mindset. And that's a way of moving, shifting. This is the question about the shifting. You know, I can move from the dyadic, where I'm plagued with worry, to inward, where I become preparing mode, to seeking, where I find all these ways to release that energy. And then I can move on. So that's a way of kind of harnessing the power of this model to do the work we need to do to be with resilience. Yeah. So the two big ways I was mentioning about shifting is to be able to grow at a growth edge from a low integrated state to a high integrated state. And the other is to be able to shift where your energy is flowing in your life, whether it's to different attendancies. So I can go, instead of being my dyadic baseline, inward, outward, inward, outward, I could go inward and do the work I need to do, be in a preparing mode, or go to outward and be in a seeking mode. Or I can shift into other vectors. So you can shift a vector and you can shift a tendency. So that would be another way. If you want to use the word shift for that, and the other one would be more about growing, but it's a kind of shifting too. Yeah. And the other way, of course, is to grow into security, to learn or earn secure attachment would be another way we can grow in our lives. Yeah, there is a way that anyone leading with any of those 9 patterns can use the wheel, because I think what happens is the wheel gives you this empowerment to go beneath these filters of personality that our temperament and the adaptive strategies we have because of our temperament create these filters. And the hub of the wheel is actually beneath those filters. So you gain, you know, in Arthur Zine's terms, you know, this access to the formless source of all form. It's a generator of diversity, a God. It's a plane of possibility that gives you hope when you can feel stuck in your own patterns. So yeah, there may be, as the mindfulness teachers have taught me, you know, these people who run extensive retreats, that there may be 9 different ways people tend to get stuck and not be able to do practices like the wheel. So there may be resistances, if you will, that are unique to each pattern. But anyone who's leading with any of those patterns can find, I think, deep growth through contemplative practice, the wheel just being one example. For example, the other day I did a 6-hour workshop, and we started with the wheel. And afterwards, you know, I asked people, did it help? And everyone thought it really helped clean that lens. When I do, you know, several day workshops, we always begin with the wheel. And at Oxford, when I did this for mindfulness teachers, I did the wheel right from the beginning, even though they're mindfulness teachers. It just helps, especially when you see, you know, the notion that this hub of the wheel is the plane of possibility, that anything on the rim are like plateaus and peaks. For those of you who don't know what I'm referring to, it's a long discussion, but just to say those plateaus are like filters that have a subset of energy patterns that are allowed to come there. And that's, I think, what personality is. It's a particular kind of plateau. So when you can drop beneath it, you're freeing yourself up from the prison that plateau may have become. But once you free it up, then you can, in a sense, infuse more possibilities, even through that now lowered plateau, which is your personality. But now it's more like a playground of possibility and freedom. And that's the beauty, I think, of the model is it really is an inside job for your client or for any of us. And it gives freedom to say, look, you may have 4 baselines. Why not? I mean, so far in the work and the narratives and the workshops, it looks like most people, like 85%, really resonate with 2, 1 or 2, sometimes 3, but and 1 or 2, that's a lot. That's 85%, 85 to 90% say these 2 are my baseline, and that's not trying to push them in it, because I always say in the workshops, you may have all 9, just see what resonates with you, see how you feel. And so that'll be an interesting research question, right? But there's no reason to have anyone say, I got to find my type. No, don't use the word type anymore, please. And use the word pattern. And because it's a pattern, it has a variety of values, and it may resonate with a lot of these different patterns. So maybe you have 5 of them, or 2, or 3, whatever you have, and that's fine. Absolutely. And thank you for asking that. So let's just go through that. And I'm sorry I didn't bring it up. So thank you, Larry, for bringing that up. So these correlate directly with the narratives, and the narratives were done through the lens of the Enneagram. So it's not a coincidence that it kind of falls together nicely, but the agency inward would be correlating with the Enneagram 1. And these terms, the mapping, harmonizing, and directing, for example, are not terms my colleagues used, and we decided not to use any names. So they're names I've come up with after the book was done and I started teaching these workshops, and they're very neutral terms. So the agency inward is 1, agency dyadic is the 9, agency outward is the 8. Then we go to the bonding vector. So agency would correlate with what's called the gut center in Enneagram terms. Bonding would correlate with what's called the heart center. And this would be bonding inward would be the 4. Bonding dyadic would be the 3. And bonding outward would be the 2. And then when we go to the certainty vector, that would correlate with what the Enneagram calls the head center of intelligence. Again, we don't think it's a center of intelligence, but a center of energy flow. And I can talk about that later if you want, but there's an autonomic reason for these locations I call them a leaf, anatomic A, location L, of energy E, activation A, and flow F. So in a leaf. So we do think there are these leaves. And the CI, the certainty inward, is the 5, the certainty dyadic is the 6, and the certainty outward is the 7. Right. And I know someone wrote in the chat, things burn out, people get into despair. And I'm kind of referring to the research literature on, literally they use the term burnout. But I agree, the burning out term is the idea that someone's in despair, is exhausted, is depleted, and especially for an activist, if your activism is driven by a real need for empowerment, then your vulnerability in these days we're in is to have a lot of anger, right? And depending on if you're coming from, the mapping pattern, you want the world to be a certain way and it's not going that way, you're going to be incredibly frustrated. So you're going to be your vulnerability for despair, if you don't want to use the word burnout, but to become depleted, right? And so you need to work at that level of saying, I can't make the world match the map that is trying to get me toward a wholeness. And then we can go to the harmonizing pattern, trying to avoid conflict. Well, this world is filled with conflict. So if the agency dyadic is your thing, you're going to be exhausted because there's so much conflict in the world. So you need to get in touch with my drive as an individual is toward wholeness, to try to be harmonizing, but it's not happening. So I'm going to work with my depletion and the way there's actually awareness of my own anger that I don't have. I got to work on that. If I'm a directing pattern in the agency outward, I'm busy trying to make the world be a certain way to make it better, which is beautiful. But if it's not going that way, I get angry outwardly. So I need to do that work. And I can go on and on through all the other 6. But you can see where each of them when you look at the motivation that's driving them as a primary starting place, they're all available for all of us. But if I'm about relational connections, relationships to nature, then I'm going to have this despair that has a quality of separation, distress, and sadness, despondency, not just fury. And if I'm in the certainty group, I'm going to be filled with fear. So you can see that the work you might do with your own inner life, or if you're working with activists, and when I speak to Joanna Macy about this, we talk about this, the work to support activism is a work to be very specific about the motivation and the emotional life of the activist that's being confronted with how the world is, a challenging place. Let's use that word instead of threatening. And then we each have this inner, sense toward wholeness. We want the world to be whole. And this is where our sensitivity is pointing it out. Exactly. In the book Intraconnected, I basically spend an entire book looking at that one question you're asking. So I'll just refer you to the book for the deeper answer than I'm able to give in this space. But I'll just say that, for me, even though I have many close colleagues and friends like Jack Kornfield and others who are, Buddhist scholars and Buddhist teachers, I when I'm on a panel with the Dalai Lama or with Jack or Lama Sultram Leone, I push against the word no self, because I think the issue is really, if you look at the writings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh, it's not so much there's no self, it's there's no separate self. So we can differentiate an internal sense of self, which has these features of spa, sensations, perspective, and agency, and say that that's not the whole of what the self is. So whether you look at Thich Nhat Hanh's beautiful term, interbeing, or His Holiness the Dalai Lama, speaks about how there was an erroneous translation of the word emptiness, that he feels it's actually inaccurate. It's empty of form, but it's full of possibility. And I talk a lot about this in the book Interconnected. Then what you realize is it isn't that there's a no self or that there's emptiness. It's that there's potentiality that arises in this formless source of all form. And what arises from that is the experience of self-experience, which can be, as we did in our first practice, in the body, an inner self. And I'm an attachment researcher, and the way the inner self has a coherence to it determines how you parent. And so I know people say, oh, but that's all, you're dividing things up. There's no self. I just don't believe that. The human nervous system constructs a sense of self. I think our task is to allow that sense of self to have that lens we talked about. So you can say, hey, I have an inner self, I have a relational self, and they're both equally real. And ultimately, when you drop into the quantum realm versus the Newtonian realm, that's a whole long discussion in Interconnected, you realize that we're hugely connected as verb-like processes, not noun-like entities. And so that gets you maybe as close to the Buddhist notion of no self, when you realize that the self-experience is really more a verb-like process of massive connectivity. It's really an important question. And it also overlaps, and Jonathan will, actually, is that Jonathan on there? We'll get ready to bring you up. It also overlaps with what people call, I never use this term, but it's whether you're a dualist or a non-dualist, and one of my dear students, now colleagues, when I was struggling with that, because people said, well, you talk about the importance of attachment, you're a dualist. And she said that Thich Nhat Hanh, who she was basically raised by, would call that a dualist fascist, because they're saying there's dualists and there's non-dualists, which is the ultimate dualist thing to say when you're being accused of being a dualist. So I found that just hilarious. Yeah, that's a great question. My view, and also our view, and the science view, is that a little bit of genetics may determine part of temperament, but not that much. So you can have identical twins who share identical genes who have very different temperaments. So it's most likely the roll of the dice. That is, you're leaning this way, so one network may get a little more growth because of gravity. Maybe the other one's leaning this way, random things. But here's the thing about neuroplasticity. A small amount of sensitivity of an inborn tendency at birth gets more neural firing, so that at a week, that network's fired more just because it was a little more sensitive, so that at a month, it's actually created more connectivity just because of this self-reinforcing process of neuroplasticity. And then at 3 months, it's really presenting itself. And that's just the way the brain works. So, again, this is not primarily a genetic thing. It is not. We almost by definition, it's not something learned. It may be shaped by the in utero environment for sure, but it's not like an experiential learning that's probably more cortical. And this looks like it's a property of the subcortical regions. So we just are proposing that aspect of temperament of vector, ABC, agency, bonding, certainty, and the way your attention goes inward, outward, or dyadic, this is our new proposal, that these are fundamental aspects of temperament, we think, and that your attachment then makes your adaptive strategy either less integrated, if it's non-secure, or integrated. And then the growth is towards this integration of your temperament, which may never ultimately change, but it can be freed up to go from a prison to a playground. That's the model. That's beautiful. I think attention is the fundamental mechanism of the mind that is directing energy flow. And if you read either The Developing Mind, the third edition especially, or Intraconnected or Aware, or especially the last 3 chapters of this book, Personality and Wholeness, any of those books, what it suggests is that the mind is, just like you're saying, Rita, capable of directing energy flow in a different way. I might not use the word thinking for that. I might use the word experiencing energy flow and cultivating awareness. And so I wouldn't use the word cognitive processing or information processing or thinking for any of that. I would more refer to it as, Joanna calls it, Joanna Macy, a quantum change in consciousness. And what I think happens is when people are learning to work with attention, and a distinct process is awareness. And to cultivate kind intention. And these are all a part of what people might call mindfulness training. You get all 3 of those in the Wheel of Awareness practice. What you're doing is you're really strengthening the mind's capacity to regulate energy flow. And when it does this, to free itself up from, we long for certainty, and we bring our energy flow up to these, what I call peaks of certain thoughts and certain emotions, and we grab onto that, or we have very restrictive plateaus that filter things. So basically what you're doing is you're allowing the mind to move those plateaus lower down to this plane of possibility. You're allowing yourself to embrace the uncertainty of the plane, not as a frightening place, which it may initially be in a world where you're trying to get certainty, but rather this incredible source, this resource you can go to again and again, of hope, of connection and love. And when people start to live with accessing the plane of possibility, which is the equivalent of the hub of the wheel, things change. So I would call that kind of a change. Joanna would call it a change in consciousness. You might call it a change in awareness that is much deeper than emotion or thought or memory. It's the process of awareness itself. And that's, I think, where identity ultimately comes from. And it gets beneath these plateaus that say we're a separate self. That's what society tells me. And it gives you the strength to embrace the deep connection. And I like to say, as we said earlier on, that we're not just a me, in these bodies, we're also a we. And the way you bring those together is me plus we is we.
Thank you, Dan. Dan's latest book, personality and wholeness in therapy. It is everywhere as of just 2 days ago. And congratulations, not just on the book, but for this really brilliant work, Dan. We're all really in your debt because we have a lot to study, and we hope to have you at the Garrison Institute in person to do a deep dive in this in the near future. So thank you everyone for your attention today. Dan, we're going to send you off to your next commitments, but we will see you soon, and lots of gratitude.
Thank you, everyone. Be well. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Fru. Thank you all.